This final unit on the colonizing of the New World discusses Kennewick Man and other Paleoamericans. This term Paleoamericans has been used by some researchers to describe some of the earliest skeletons from the New World that have cranial characteristics that are atypical of modern Native American populations. It would be best if you have viewed the video Nova First People of the Americas and done the reading from National Geographic before viewing this lecture. So who is Kennewick Man, or as he's also referred to, the Ancient One, and why is he important? On the left we see the skull of Kennewick Man, and on the right a reconstruction of his face based upon the attachment points of muscles on the skull. Using clay, forensic sculptors can model the features based upon the known size and shape of muscles that would go onto the skull. In the Nova episode, there is a different reconstruction that gives Kennewick Man hair and facial hair. Kennewick Man is one of the earliest human skeletons found in the Americas. The individual was found in 1996 along the Columbia River near the town of Kennewick, Washington, and the remains are approximately 9,500 years old. The discovery of the remains on land that is controlled by the United States Army Corps of Engineers has led to a lengthy legal battle between scientists and Native American groups. Should the remains be made available to scientists for research, or should they be returned to Native American groups for reburial under the terms of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990? Since the remains came from federally controlled lands, they are subject to this act. However, the provisions of this act require scientific study to make a determination of cultural affiliation prior to repatriation of the remains. This and other early specimens have skull characteristics that are atypical of modern Native Americans and thus are of great interest to scientists studying the colonization of the New World. These crania have characteristics that are more like modern Austronesian populations, which include Polynesians, the indigenous people of Taiwan, the Formosans, and the Ainu, an indigenous people of northern Japan. It calls into question some of the traditional models of the peopling of the Americas. Other examples from North America include skeletons from Nevada, Idaho, California, Oregon, and other western states. And there are also many examples from Brazilian rock shelters that were used repeatedly for burials. And as you learned in the Nova episode, there are recent discoveries in caves in the Yucatan that are even earlier than Kennewick Man. Douglas Owsley of the Smithsonian Institution, who was interviewed in the Nova episode and was the lead plaintiff in the case to gain access to the remains, is shown here with his colleague analyzing Kennewick Man after they were granted that right by the courts. Here you can see how, when doing an analysis, they have arranged the remains in anatomical order. The remains were remarkably well preserved and fairly complete. Most of the bones, small bones of the hands and feet were present. Some had been missing, but even both kneecaps were present, as you can see. Patterns of calcium carbonate deposition on the bones, only along the bottoms of bones, if they'd been laid out in this orientation, suggests that the body had been laid in a grave purposefully on its back. It was a formal burial. At the time of his death, Kennewick Man was between 45 and 50 years old. He was 5 feet 9 inches tall and strongly muscled. He had repetitive wear of his right elbow that may have been a repetitive stress injury from repeatedly using an atlatl, sort of like tennis elbow, a disorder that is from the hyperextension of the elbow, repeated hyperextension of the elbow doing a tennis serve. It would be similar to the hyperextension of the elbow that occurs with repeated use of an atlatl. Kennewick Man had led a difficult life and had suffered several episodes of trauma. He had a stone point embedded in his left hip, most likely in his teens based upon the regrowth of bone over the embedded point. 5 ribs on the right side of his body were broken and healed, and he had a healed depression fracture to the frontal bone of the skull that likely derived from a blow from a club in a face-to-face conflict with another individual. None of these injuries, however, was fatal, and all of them had evidence of post-traumatic healing. The stone projectile point embedded in the hip was one of the first clues to the analysts that this was not a recent murder victim or a historic burial that had been stumbled across, but rather a prehistoric set of remains. The point is a cascade point which dates to the period between 10,000 and 8,000 before present, and is found in that area of the Pacific coast in the Cascade Mountains. Several other remains with unusual cranial characteristics have also been rediscovered in collections or found in recent excavations. These include the man from Spirit Cave, Nevada, a mummy that had been recovered in the 1930s and stored at the Nevada State Museum. During the Nevada State Museum's inventory of the human remains for the purposes of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, the remains were radiocarbon dated and found to be surprisingly old. It had not been believed that these remains were as old as they are, more than 9,000 years old, because of the remarkable preservation of some of the other objects that were found with the burial, including moccasins and woven mats that were made from reeds and bark. Some of the remains that have been found to have these atypical cranial characteristics have been repatriated under the terms of NAGPRA and been reburied, or as in the alarmist phrases used in this graphic from the Friends of America past to oppose the repatriation of remains, they are gone forever. Others are in jeopardy and not available because there have not been decisions made yet as to what is going to happen to them. The advancement of science is an important consideration, but also the feelings and values of descendant populations are also important for archaeologists to consider. As archaeologists, we are anthropologists and should respect the cultural values of the objects of our study, and we need to come to an agreement with Native American populations what is the best ways to approach research on the past that is respectful of their ancestors. The deeply felt values of Native American descendant populations are seen in the NOVA video when we see the representatives from different tribes who seek the reburial of Kennewick Man, and we see them meeting with the Erskine Villislev, the geneticist who has been studying the Ancient One's genes and was able to determine that there are genetic relationships between Kennewick Man and modern Native American populations. In addition to Kennewick Man and other examples from North America, and Eva, the example from the Yucatan as discussed in the NOVA episode, there are also many skulls with atypical cranial characteristics that come from burial caves in southeastern Brazil, one of whom, the earliest of which, has been nicknamed Lucia. Caves in this region of Brazil have many burials that may span thousands of years and appear to have been repeatedly used by generation after generation of hunter-gatherers returning to these caves and bringing the remains of their ancestors to join with the remains of earlier ancestors, suggesting use of formal cemeteries that made claims to regions and places based upon the long-term association of this group of people. While most of these burials are tightly flexed individuals, some of the earliest are what archaeologists call bundle burials. They are bones that had been disarticulated and perhaps all of the flesh had decayed before they were gathered up and then transported to the cave for burial, suggesting that people on a seasonal round moving about the area, highly mobile hunter-gatherers, may have returned there with the remains of their deceased ancestors in order to bury them in the cave. There's also sometimes post-mortem modification of the bones, as we see in the lower right-hand photo. Painting of bones suggests that they were defleshed and interacted with before their interral within the cave. The top right bones show long bones that are missing their ends, the epiphyses. In younger individuals, these have not fully fused, and after decay and disarticulation may have been lost before the bones were gathered up and transported to the cave for reburial. So when we say that the earliest crania found in the New Worlds have characteristics that are atypical of later Native American populations, what do we mean? How do we use skeletal characteristics to determine race? Different human populations have evolved identifiable cranial characteristics, differences within these populations that have developed by adaptations to different environments. 4 general human cranial phenotypes have been defined. A phenotype is the physical expression of genetic diversity. These 4 general human cranial phenotypes are Australoid, Caucasoid, Mongoloid, and Negroid. Australoid are characteristic of populations of Australia and Polynesia, Caucasoid of Europe and western parts of Asia, Mongoloid of eastern parts of Asia, and Negroid of Africa. These represent definably distinct combinations of morphological traits, traits related to the size and shape of the skull. But these are not separate and distinct categories, but rather they're a variation along a continuum within the entire human population. And analysts have created these distinct categories in order to allow them to understand and partition and analyze this variation. Now, some of the morphological traits that are used to distinguish these different phenotypes include what's called gonial inversion, the shape of the jawbone, midfacial characteristics, those characteristics of the size and shape of the cheekbones and the nasal aperture, the opening for the nose. Prognathism is how much the nose and the mouth stick forward from the plane of the face. And the shape of the dental arcade. When looking at the upper palate of the mouth from the bottom, how is that shaped in terms of its arch? So this slide shows some of the differences between Mongoloid skeletal attributes and Caucasoid skeletal attributes. When Kennewick Man was first discovered, some unfortunate statements made by paleoanthropologists were given great weight by the press. When describing the differences between Kennewick Man and Native American populations, paleoanthropologist James Chatters said that Kennewick Man's skull had some Caucasoid-like characteristics. He did not say that it was a Caucasoid skull, although that was what the media in some cases seemed to interpret and report. Rather, he was saying that some of the characteristics were distinct from Mongoloid, and these Caucasoid characteristics are found in many Austronesian skulls. But to review some of the characteristics and compare them side by side to see how these vary, one is variation in the dental arcade, the shape of the curve that's formed by the teeth in the upper palate. The Mongoloid on the left is elliptical, while the Caucasoid on the right is parabolic. The elliptical one is the ratio between the width and the breadth is more equal than in the parabolic Caucasoid one. Some Caucasoid midfacial characteristics are shared by Austronesian populations, and these include the shape of the nasal aperture. In Caucasoid crania, you have a more sloped eye orbit and a narrow interorbital area. The suture that joins the bones in the cheek is an S shape. But most importantly, the nose is shown to be slightly larger and more projecting based upon the steepled nasals and more prominent nasal spine, a characteristic found in Kennewick man. Mongoloid crania, including modern Native American populations, have more projecting cheekbones, rounded eye orbits, and very different nasal apertures that are wider and less projecting. Other unique Mongoloid characteristics include aspects of dentition like shoveled incisors and wormian bones. Wormian bones are when there's a complex pattern of small bones at the suture that occurs between cranial components in the very back of the crania. All Mongoloid crania have shoveled incisors, but not all Mongoloid crania have wormian bones, and the presence of wormian bones does not necessarily indicate Mongoloid, as this feature occurs in low frequencies in other populations. It just occurs in much greater frequency within Mongoloid populations. So how do researchers measure variation in the size and shape of the skull and face? Using particular landmarks on skulls, they take a series of measurements and then are able to statistically compare them with other skulls, individually and on the basis of large samples. Researchers Walter Nevis and Mark Hubie compared a sample of these crania from Lagoa Santa with a larger world sample. In their analyses, they separated males and females because sex can affect the size and shape, with males generally larger than females. They also corrected for a size effect where there is differences in sizes in different populations, most likely resulting from differences in diet and nutrition. In each of these graphs, the Lagoa Santa sample is shown as an open circle that is surrounded by an ellipse with a dashed line. This ellipse represents the 95% confidence interval around the sample, and those other data points that are within this ellipse are more similar to the Lagoa Santa sample than those that fall outside of it. And as you'll notice, in most of these, the most closely related samples are those from Australia or Polynesia or some Native American populations, suggesting that they do have some morphological similarity to early Circum-Pacific populations that contributed to later Polynesian and Australian populations. Nevis and his colleagues suggested that this represented two waves of migration by two biologically distinct populations into the New World, an early migration of people carrying these distinct cranial characteristics, and a later population that had cranial characteristics more typical of modern Native American populations. These later migrants outnumbered and overwhelmed the earlier populations, absorbing some remnants of them. However, the pattern of genetic diversity suggests something perhaps even more complex. Rolando Gonzalez-Jose and colleagues re-examined the data from Lagoa Santa in the context of a larger sample, where they tried to draw from early contemporary samples from the Old World to compare these two. And here they show the Paleoamerican and early Old World samples of being largely overlapping, and also as a midpoint between early Old World and later Asian populations, and firmly along the entire continuum of variability that exists in modern Native American populations, from the Eskimo Aleut of the north to the Tlatelolcans or Aztecs of Central America. So rather than being some very distinct population, they are firmly within the range of variability that we might expect for populations from that time period, related to early Old World populations and also related to later Asian and Native American populations. Cranial morphology is actually a remarkably plastic characteristic, and it responds fairly rapidly to changes in environment and diet. A series of classic studies that were done in the early 20th century and have been re-examined by modern paleoanthropologists have found that immigrant populations to America in the early part of the 20th century changed their cranial characteristics within a few generations in response to changes in diet and environment. Gonzalez-Gozé and his colleagues suggest that the differences in early cranial characteristics from modern characteristics, rather than resulting from two separate biological components colonizing the New World, can be seen as resulting from a single biological component. There was continued gene flow as different populations exchanged genes across different boundaries, and there was genetic drift as populations in East Asia and the Americas became more separated and interacted less frequently. And this led to distinctions between East Asian and American populations, and these later populations were distinct from earlier populations themselves. This model is supported by recent genetic studies that are based upon very large samples. These studies suggest that there was an initial peopling of Beringia during the last glacial maximum, and that populations living in Beringia stayed there for a period of time and diversified genetically, and it is from these very genetically diverse populations that we then had a very swift peopling of the Americas. There was later arrival of other genetic diversity, but there was also back migration of genetic diversity that developed in Beringia and in the New World back into northeastern Asia. So what to remember? The earliest skeletons that have been found in the Americas have different cranial characteristics than those found in modern Native Americans. They have characteristics that are more typical of modern Austronesian populations that live in Polynesia, Taiwan, and northern Japan, and they may result from a common ancestry from an earlier circum-Pacific population. In both ancient and modern populations, cranial variation, however, occurs along a continuum, and it has been arbitrarily partitioned into different analytical categories like race in order to understand this variation. Genetic data indicate that there is a very complex picture of movement of different groups into the New World from Northeast Asia, and that a very diverse founding population came from Northeastern Asia into the New World.